Good afternoon, everybody. After so many days, we're finally coming closer to the end. This is the presidential panel, Building a More Just World. We will start with a land acknowledgement. As noted in more detail in the opening ceremony, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the indigenous peoples of this region. Our session today, Building a More Just World, and I will give a brief description. Each of the panelists has an amazing bio, but we want to really stick to the time, and we also want to be sure we give each of the panelists the full amount of time. I'm going to do it very briefly. The session description, as we have just briefly put, despite the overbearing, complex, and ubiquitous structures of power and violence, the World Congress of Sociology considers and emphasizes that a more socially just world is possible. The panelists of this closing presidential panel will end by reflecting on identifying new ways of thinking and avenues for change. This includes case studies that highlight the need to conceptualize, reconceptualize new rights frameworks and develop new paradigms and practices for building a more just world. We have 4 wonderful panelists here, and each of them will speak for 15 minutes. Our first speaker for today is Professor Mary Romero from Arizona State University. The title of her paper is Feminism, Motherhood, and the Globalization of Reproduction. What is justice? Dr. Mary Romero is a professor of justice studies and social inquiry at Arizona State University, and she is the 110th president of the American Sociological Association. She's a 2017 recipient of the Cox Johnson Fraser Award. She has multiple publications and awards. She's the author of Introducing Intersectionality, one of her books, the other one, The Maid's Daughter, Living Inside and Outside of the American Dream. Mary has written extensively on care workers of Guatemala. She's a social researcher and activist who accompanies processes of defense and recovery of communal lands. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mary Romero.
Thank you for inviting me to join you on this panel today. Well, the news carried images of ICE pulling children and babies from their mother's arms, crying and traumatized children in cages, and distraught parents. Ivanka Trump posted a picture embracing her 2-year-old son. She was immediately criticized for her insensitivity in sharing a photo of sweet family moment, while ICE enforced her father's zero-tolerance policy that separate children from their parents at the border. Responses to her post included, "Too bad all mothers in America can't enjoy the same. And what would you do if you were separated from your children? Would be rather painful, don't you think? And nobody would care, especially your father. Sad. Imagine being the mother of a child born in a country your father would describe as shithole. Would you also try to leave to give your child a better future? Glad you know where your kids are. Now, what about the 1,500 moms whose kids were taken at the border and now are lost? What about those children, Ivanka?" Trump supporters responded in a predictable manner by claiming fake news about the missing children reported in the New York Times and claimed the photos of ICE bus fitted with buster seats for children and migrant children in cages were from the Obama administration. The question remains, what, if any, is significant of Ivanka's photo? Juxtaposing Ivanka's photo with the shocking images and painful crying sounds of migrant mothers and children as they were separate is as troubling as the message, "I don't really care, do you?" on Milana's jacket. Guardian columnist Ara Madaw's response resonated with my research findings on women's anti-immigrant group in Arizona. In response, she wrote, "When Ivanka tweeted the photo on Sunday, I don't think it was a gaffe. I think she knew exactly what she was doing. which was playing to Trump's specific base, reminding him that it's white families like hers, like theirs, who are important, not the brown families who Trump is breaking up, using the image of herself as a loving mother to provide a human face to Trump's inhumane administration. Ivanka is an important complement to Trump's messaging. He does all the crass dehumanization of immigrants, lumping them together with gang MS-13 and calling them dangerous animals that the U.S. needs to protect itself from. She provides the inspirational imagery of the U.S. that needs protecting, end of quote. Against the horrific backdrop of images of separating children from parents, Ivanka's pose serves to remind U.S. citizens what real motherhood looks like: white mothers and white children, not brown or black mothers and children. The simultaneous appearances of these opposing images include coded messages appealing to white mothers' concern for their children's welfare by constructing migrant children as future threats against their white children. It is also important to note that the administration positioned white women to justify the action and respond to the criticism of the family separation policy. As Jessie Daniels noted in her opinion piece, Why the Face of Family Separation is a White Woman, framing family separation as a woman's issue is created by having White House Press Secretary Sanders and Homeland Security Secretary Nelson defend the policy to the public. Following General Attorney Jeff Sessions' claim that separating migrant children and from their parents is rooted in the Bible, Sanders argued that it's very biblical to enforce the law. And in response to CNN reporter's question, "Do you believe this practice is moral?" she replied, "It's a moral policy to follow and enforce the law." Nielsen reported to the Senate committee, "Our policy is, if you break the law, we will prosecute you," suggesting that the two options are either separating families or not enforcing the law. Nielsen has argued that news coverage of the children abused and warehoused in cages are hearsay stories. On June 17th, she tweeted, "This misrepresenting of members by the press and advocacy groups must stop. It is irresponsible and unproductive. As I have said many times before, if you are seeking asylum for your family, there is no reason to break the law and illegally cross between ports of entry." She then followed this up with the tweet, "We do have a policy of separating families at the border, period." In her speech to the National Sheriff's Association, she referred to the children as criminal aliens. This is consistent with the administration's insistence that the children are gang members or as they are future recruits if they are allowed into the United States. Nielsen has also insisted that the separation are no different from parents separated from their families when they are convicted of a crime and sent to prison. This practice of separating migrant mothers and children at the border appears after 2 decades of anti-immigrant rhetoric. It is worth examining how migrant mothers have been stripped of their humanity and submitted to this state-sanctioned violence. In his research on news coverage of immigration, Leo Chavez found that in times of low immigration sentiment, images of migrant mother and child dyad appear rather than images denoting danger. Images of migrant mothers and children appeared during periods of empathy and the recognition of shared humanity. How have we reached a point that migrant women and children are viewed as unworthy of asylum and as economic and security threats? Juxtaposing the images of Ivanka's white motherhood with brown and black mothers being separated from their children, I am reminded of the images and metaphors used by the Arizona-based women's anti-immigration group, Mothers Against Illegal Aliens, MAIA, founded by Michelle Delacroix in January 2006. MAIA popularized white motherhood with Madonna logo, very much like Ivanka's pose. In the MAIA Madonna logo, there is also an explicit patriotic stance to the image, consisting of a U.S. flag blended into the image of the mother looking lovingly down on the baby. The image is complete with the slogan, "Protect our children, protect our borders." Like the Maya logo, Ivanka's photo represents the ideal motherhood, which not only draws a stark contrast to the migrant mothers and their children of color, but normalizes her father's immigration enforcement. Trump's base accepted his reference of immigrants as vermin investing the country and refuses to accept them as legitimate candidates for asylum, but rather sees them as criminals engaged in murder, child abuse and neglect, car theft, prostitution, racketeering, and rape. Even those crossing the border is an administrative offense and not a criminal offense. Trump followers agree with Attorney General Jeff Sessions when he said, "If you are smuggling a child, we will prosecute you, and that child will be separated from you as required by law. If you don't like that, then don't smuggle your children over the border." Revisiting my research on Maya, I identify reoccurring themes and images and metaphors used to deny migrant mothers of color their motherhood. Instead, their motherhood is constructed as a direct threat to U.S. citizen mothers and their children. Positioning themselves as mothers, Maya asserted, and I quote, "It is up to the mother to protect her family." And their stated mission was, quote, "to bring awareness to and educate legal American families whose children are the silent victims of this invasion of illegal aliens," end of quote. Based on an interview conducted with Delacroix about her motives for Maya, a Los Angeles reporter outlined her purpose as based on fear for the future of her two children because Mexican-born citizens, which she referred to as creating a genocide and raping the country by demanding social services. As other race-based nativist groups, Maya claims an ideology of white injury by casting white middle-class citizens as the real victims, and more specifically, their white children. Instead of acknowledging the erosion of public services are the consequences of tax cuts and neoliberal policies, Mexican migrant children are blamed for overcrowded schools, low-achieving schools, poor access to affordable health care, and the overall drain on public benefits. Maya's anti-immigrant message is framed as pro-family, much like the Republican Party embrace of family values. Having traced Maya's emergence among other anti-immigrant groups in Arizona, I analyzed the data from their website over a 12-month period between November 2006 to 2007, the interviews they conducted with local, national, and international news organizations, and news coverage of the group's activities. Maya emerged as one of the first and only anti-immigrant organizations vilifying Mexican mothers and their children. Although a short-lived organization, Delacroix was successful in getting her nativist and racist immigration discourse against Mexican women in the mainstream through her 50-plus interviews with national and international news media. Maya is one of the first to use the term anchor baby, to attack birthright citizenship, and to weave nativism with mothering and feminist discourse. Framing a race-based nativist message in motherhood discourse distracts attention from the activist and vigilante type of anti-immigrant campaign targeting other mothers and their children. A motherhood platform is used primarily to construct immigrant mothers as distinctively different from mothers who are citizens of the United States. Maya's anti-immigration discourse socially constructs unauthorized mothers, namely Mexican immigrants, as unfit mothers who are morally and legally unable to have children who are U.S. citizens. Their proclamation specifically identifies women as a focus. Quote, "The biological fact that a woman can birth a child is the instrument by which the illegal alien woman utilizes to demand citizenship and residence in the United States," end of quote. To counter any empathy or shared humanity that the mother-child image might generate, Maya always refers to Mexican immigrant women's procreation as breeding. Like Trump's recent reference to immigrants as animals, Maya's literature, sound bites, and interviews consist of carefully selected words and metaphors that reinforce the image of immigrant mothers and children as less than human. This is most often communicated in their articles and blog statements by using the slogan, "I support people," as one word, When referring to immigrants, they are alien, foreign, and inferior. Immigrant women are always illegal alien females, and their children are anchor babies or illegal alien infants. They frequently refer to migrant mothers as breeders, rather than engaged in the lofty activity of motherhood. Immigrant mothers are characterized as illegal alien women who are producing and utilizing children as hostages until demands for citizenship are met in the United States. Migrant mothers are characterized as crossing our border to steal the American dream by giving birth. The predatory nature of these immigrant women is further grounded by outlining an imaginary strategy that is purposely used to steal the American dream away from the children in from U.S. citizens. 1, you sneak over the border. 2, you get pregnant as fast as possible and as many times as possible. 3rd, use your child as a weapon of choice to blackmail the U.S. to get to stay. And 4th, call every U.S. citizen a racist and homewrecker who wants you and your child to leave and return to your country. The outlined strategy does not focus on the legality of entering the United States without authorization, but rather the ways that immigrant women are immoral, sneaky, conniving, and do not deserve to embrace motherhood. Just as Sanders and Nielsen justify the policy of separating children from their mothers at the border, Maya characterized immigrant women as criminals and not worthy of motherhood by equating immigrant mothers raising their children as an act of child abuse towards the children of U.S. citizens. I quote, "A child is a responsibility of the parents, not a country to raise. A child being used by a mother to steal from the mouths of legal children in the U.S. should be charged with child abuse for attempting to benefit from their crime and profiting from additional actions while within the interior of the U.S., end of quote. Previously, immigrant women were portrayed acting immorally towards their own children by using them for their own personal gains. Maya builds on this premise to argue that immigrant women's actions are attributed to being child abuse against the children of U.S. citizens. This claim of child abuse is enforced by linking immigration as a cause of government cutbacks in public education. Criminalizing the mothering of immigrant women is also evident in the recent trend towards charging parents with smuggling when they migrate with their children. Here again, these children are framed as placing their children in harm's way. Nielsen, along with her male colleagues, continue to argue that migrant children are safe and well cared for. While many of us considered Maya an extremist group in 2007, the current migrant crisis created by the Trump administration demonstrates the degree to which Michelle Delacroix's racist, nativist, anti-immigration campaign has been incorporated into state violence against migrant mothers. Ivanka's manipulation of the classic Madonna symbol of mothers represents white mothers as ideal motherhood. Ivanka constructed an image that is juxtaposed with arresting mothers seeking asylum on charges of smuggling that Sanders and Nielsen can use to reinforce the state's argument that migrant mothers' relationship to their children is self-serving rather than self-sacrificing. The Trump administration's use of popular anti-immigration metaphor perpetuates the images of immigrants as less than human that justify state-sanctioned separation of mothers and children. Cast as illegal females rather than migrant mothers, the pain and suffering encountered by family separation is attributed to these parents. Both motherhood and reproductive rights are under attack in a current refugee and migrant crisis in the U.S.-Mexico border, as well as other national borders around the world. Thank you very much.
I'm going to sit here Thank you very much, Mary. Our second speaker today is Dr. Gladys TZUL, who's a co-founder of the Instituto Amaq, Guatemala. And the title of her paper, which she will present in Spanish, is called Critical Keys to Understand the Tensions Between the Transformation and Conservation of Communal Land, Kinship, Use, and Ownership of Land. Dr. Gladys TZUL has her PhD in sociology from the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities of the Autonomous University of Puebla. She's co-founder of the Amaq Institute, where she currently carries out research called La Varamanda, Institutions, Times, and Strategies of Indigenous Communal Government in Post-War Guatemala. In 2016, she was part of the legal team for the release of indigenous political prisoners who defend communal lands. Her role in the team was to build a socio-historical expertise that served as a political argument to build the defense of indigenous communal authorities. Please join me in welcoming Gladys TZUL.
Hi, good afternoon. I read it in Spanish. And claves críticas para comprender las tensiones entre transformación y conservación de la tierra comunal, parentesco, uso y propiedad. ¿Cómo y de qué manera se hereda la tierra comunal? ¿Cómo se conserva la tierra comunal y al mismo tiempo se alteran las jerarquías y antagonismos? Estas preguntas orientan la estructuración del argumento y permite presentar una clave entre transformación y conservación de los medios concretos para la reproducción de la vida, en el que las mujeres indígenas que viven en tierras comunales son las principales defensoras y agentes. Ensayo, pues, una explicación en un territorio concreto de cómo se inscriben las relaciones sociales que dan cuerpo, forma a la política comunal indígena, donde existe una amalgama de estrategias para regular las formas de uso y las jerarquías que inauguran al parentesco como una forma de autorregulación social que, sin embargo, ha sido producida como una estrategia defensiva de las tierras comunales. Es decir, las alianzas de parentesco fueron y son las estrategias que lograron poner límite al avance del proyecto liberal para convertir a propietarios comunales en propietarios indígenas. Pensar críticamente el parentesco, más allá de entenderlo como una estrategia para cuidar la tierra, también produce poderosos efectos en la conservación de la cohesión interna y que a la vez tiene efectos de inhibición de las fuerzas de las mujeres indígenas, pues establece que se tenga que organizar la reproducción de la vida únicamente a partir del formato matrimonial acotado para quedar incluidos en la trama más general de la reproducción de la vida y de la conservación de la tierra y los bienes comunales. Pero el matrimonio como única forma de organizar la reproducción de la vida es un problema que comparten una gran cantidad de mujeres. Esas dificultades en términos materiales y simbólicos van desde los nudos que expresan la propiedad como registra la propiedad y los bienes por los que el hombre y la mujer trabajan, hasta la tutela de los hijos. Por ejemplo, en 1917, muchas mujeres lucharon por criticar a la estructura familiar y al matrimonio como bases de la familia y a la sujeción de los cuerpos de las mujeres, también como el control del marido, y estas luchas alcanzaron una radicalidad solo comparable a la belicosa reacción que durante el estalinismo buscó situar a las mujeres una vez más como productoras de hijas de la patria, confinándolas a un régimen familiar recrudecido. Las dificultades que las mujeres indígenas enfrentamos en la trama comunal, en tanto el parentesco se organiza a través de linajes patrilineales, no es entonces un variante al problema general de varias mujeres, que una cantidad de mujeres confrontamos en la actualidad. Sin embargo, la singularidad de pensar el parentesco en noción de tierras comunales consiste en pensar que la reproducción y la transmisión de la herencia comunal de la tierra, en tanto se hace en clave patrilineal, nos coloca en un lugar en el cual somos empujadas a realizar estrategias matrimoniales de manera acotada frente a los portadores de los apellidos históricos. Sin embargo, es preciso desarrollar una serie de distinciones que existen al interior. Por ejemplo, mujeres que deciden hacer contrato matrimonial con algunos portadores de los apellidos históricos, y algunas que deciden no hacerlo con personas que pertenecen a los apellidos históricos, y aquellas quienes deciden no hacer contrato matrimonial para procrear. En todos casos, el problema lo pienso a partir de la noción inclusión diferenciada, y esa noción de inclusión diferenciada es útil en términos analíticos para evitar el acercamiento analítico, inclusión-exclusión, propio para pensar las luchas de las mujeres indígenas, o como algunos artefactos teóricos lo han pensado. De tal manera que el problema de las mujeres indígenas, si se aborda desde la clave inclusión-exclusión, se asume pues que las mujeres estaríamos excluidas de la trama comunal, lo cual no es cierto, es falso. Por ello no es casualidad que quienes realicen talleres de género sin comprender la potencia de lo comunitario que garantizan la reproducción de la vida, a veces propongan e impongan de manera irresponsable un horizonte de igualación propia. En tal sentido, entonces, hay una serie de preguntas que son importantes construir para pensar estas maneras de inclusión diferenciada. Y esta es cómo transformamos el formato de reproducción sin perder el control comunal de la tierra, cómo se transmite la herencia comunal de la tierra sin que sean únicamente los apellidos patrilineales quienes los aseguren. Estas preguntas y estas propuestas de entrada no consideran la partición de la tierra ni convertir la tierra comunal en series de pequeños propietarios. En términos complejos, entonces, estamos frente a la noción de transformación. Estamos criticando la idea revolucionaria de transformación que pretende arrastrar y desechar lo que existe y reconstruirlo todo. Este significado del término de transformación nos parece que no termina siendo útil, y presentamos la noción de transformación, trabajada por Gutiérrez y Salazar, quienes entienden la noción de transformación en la relación de la capacidad colectiva de producir más allá o en contra y más allá de todo. Dicen, la transformación social deviene así en el despliegue de la capacidad humana de producir y reproducir formas colectivas de habitar al mundo desde otro lugar que no sea la dominación, la explotación y el despojo. Pensar entonces en la posibilidad de transformar y conservar simultáneamente me sirve para poder comprender las luchas de las mujeres indígenas que simultáneamente quieren seguir habitando y conservando la tierra comunal al mismo tiempo que se desea alterar parte de las estructuras políticas internas como el parentesco. De ahí pues el carácter estructural de las luchas de las mujeres, que a pesar de quedar muchas veces invisibilizadas, dada la negación moderna del mundo de la reproducción, son ellas las que se hacen cargo de la economía para el sustento de la vida, son ellas las que se encargan de las organizaciones de las fiestas y de alimentar a las multitudes en las grandes rebeliones. Es la fuerza de ellas las que emana desde el mundo cotidiano producido desde las unidades de la reproducción. En tal sentido, la triada, parentesco y uso propiedad de la tierra, nos va a presentar a una serie de lógicas interpretativas que ensayo, por ejemplo, como la política del deseo. ¿Qué significa entonces pensar conservar y transformar la tierra comunal conservar la propiedad comunal de la tierra al mismo tiempo que se alteran las lógicas de jerarquía. Ensayo entonces un camino que es el camino de la política del deseo. Una política del deseo subvierte una política de los derechos y permite más allá del derecho y no solamente centrado en él, pero también permite salir de las representaciones de la miseria femenina de las mujeres indígenas que viven en las mujeres. Habilita otra ruta emancipadora que no quede comprometida de entrada con la participación de la tierra y con la cotitulación propia de la cultura liberal. Ahora bien, vamos a regresar. Estas son fotografías de mujeres en talleres que discuten y analizan al respecto de la posibilidad de pensar la tierra en términos de uso y no en términos de propiedad. El deseo de las mujeres indígenas contiene múltiples rostros. Reiteradamente se enuncia en asambleas, en talleres y en levantamientos y se nombra más o menos así: que la tierra se use comunalmente, que la tierra se use comunalmente y que se herede a las generaciones siguientes, no solo por medio del parentesco. Este deseo que contiene una potente fuerza anticapitalista y que la tierra no sea usada como propiedad privada y que el control y uso de los medios concretos para reproducir nuestras vidas sea deliberado entre hombres y mujeres. Ese, en parte, es un deseo cumplido y en parte no, pues las tierras comunales han sido la principal estrategia de vida y de la resistencia a largo plazo, pero al mismo tiempo también ha producido jerarquización de la inclusión en tanto somos mujeres. Las preguntas acerca del deseo de las mujeres indígenas son ambiciosas porque son plurales y rebasan la capacidad en una conferencia, pero muchas veces en las rebeliones y en las asambleas comunales y en las fiestas, los discursos que son movilizadores dicen más o menos así: esta tierra es nuestra, esta tierra comunal es nuestra, queremos vivir en esta tierra con nuestros hijos y con nuestras hijas. A continuación, voy a presentar una estructura de las maneras de cómo es que se habitan las tierras comunales, aun y cuando el parentesco esté jerarquizando, de todos modos hay estrategias de uso. Es importante entonces determinar que el derecho sirve para pensar la propiedad, o es útil para pensar la propiedad, pero el uso nos permite pensar a partir de la lógica del uso. Por ejemplo, existen mujeres que forman contratos patrilineales con hombres que pertenecen a las estructuras históricas del parentesco. Ahí las mujeres y sus hijos tienen herencia directa, pero son mediadas por el marido. Existen también estructuras donde las mujeres hacen contrato matrimonial con hombres que están fuera del matrimonio y son las mujeres las que habilitan el proceso de herencia directa. Existen también unidades de reproducción de mujeres con otras mujeres que crían a niños, donde también el proceso de la herencia es directo. En todo caso, en las 4 descomposiciones, las mujeres tienen uso de la propiedad comunal. En ese sentido, la pregunta es: ¿qué es lo que está en juego en pensar las nociones de transformación y de conservación de la tierra comunal? Pasa por la profunda política movilizadora de las rebeliones indígenas que están permanentemente construyendo estrategias y lógicas para no perder lo que se tiene, no perder la tierra comunal que por siglos se ha defendido ante la imposición de la colonia y ante la construcción de la república, en el cual las mujeres han estructurado una serie de estrategias en términos de la interpretación y el análisis de los contratos matrimoniales. Finalmente, creo que es importante establecer, en algunas fotografías, establecer que en las estructuras de política comunal la lógica de pensar la lucha de las mujeres habría que comprenderlas a partir de la política de los deseos y a partir también de la noción de inclusión diferenciada, donde las mujeres hacen parte constitutiva de lo comunal, sin embargo, se inscriben de manera diferenciada. En ese sentido, la política comunal y las interpretaciones de las mujeres que viven en políticas comunales establecen un desafío a la interpretación liberal que piensa a las mujeres en el marco únicamente de la inclusión y de la exclusión. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Montserrat Sagat from the Universidad de Costa Rica, and her paper is titled, "What is Justice for a Victim of Femicide? Challenging the Concepts of Rights and Justice from a Context of Disposability of Female Bodies." Dr. Montserrat Sagat is an anthropologist and sociologist from Costa Rica, professor of sociology and women's studies. She has been an associate dean of graduate studies. Currently, she's a chair of the Research Center for Women's Studies at Universidad de Costa Rica. Montserrat has also worked as a consultant for several international organizations such as the Pan American Health Organization, UNICEF, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights on issues related to violence against women, femicide, sexual exploitation of children, child labor, human rights, and gender and development. She has published widely in Spanish, English, and Portuguese about violence against women, femicide, and the feminist movement in Latin America. Please join me in welcoming Montserrat Sagat.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maggie, for the introduction and also for the invitation. I'm going to start with a few questions. Is it possible to talk about human rights when people, particularly women, have been expelled from the very category of humans by extreme conditions of dispossession, like the ones existing in Central America, provoked by the reworking of colonial practices and neoliberalism? Is there justice for bare life? What is the meaning of a concept like the right to choose when a woman has to struggle for food and water every day in order to ensure her survival? What is the effectiveness, and for whom, of the legislation regarding violence against women when drugstores in El Salvador have big signs announcing they have in stock the anti-rape shot, referring to the contraceptive Depo-Provera, which is used by women who are going to start their journey as irregular immigrants to the US? What is the ethical and ontological importance of a concept like justice in a context in which the vast majority of femicides have never and will never be judicialized, as it happens in Central America? So my argument is that, in a context of instrumentalization of human existence and disposability of many female bodies, the rights and justice paradigms losing their moral weight and legitimacy, unless we can envision new ways to integrate them within a more general and wider framework of emancipation. In this context, I question the rights paradigm and its supposed challenge to unequal relations of power. In addition, I also question the concept of justice as it is used in liberal democracies because of its instrumental logic and punitive nature. But let me first provide some data that supports my assertion that in Central America, we experience a context of disposability of female bodies. Central America is one of the most violent regions in the world outside of an open war zone, like countries like El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, presenting some of the highest homicide rates. As a result of this deadly process, El Salvador has also the highest femicide rate in the world. In fact, in 2017, Amnesty International defined El Salvador as one of the most dangerous countries for women. Guatemala and Honduras are also among the 10 countries with the highest femicide rates. And as a regional tendency, female homicides have increased at a much higher rate than male homicide during the last years. In Honduras, after the coup in 2009, male homicide rates increased around 60%. That is terrible for any country. But female homicide rates increased 246%. In Guatemala, during the last 5 years, the proportion of female homicides victims has increased in relation to the total homicides. In fact, this is a general tendency. Even in industrialized countries, a general decrease in homicide rates has not been accompanied by an equivalent decline in the violent deaths of women, in part because levels of intimate partner homicide remain high. So we are actually experiencing a context everywhere in which female homicides are increasing. Violence against women is an extreme manifestation of gender discrimination and a deadly tool to perpetuate women's subordination. A femicide involves the killing of women by men based on a sense of superiority, by sexual pleasure, or by assumption of ownership over women. While femicide is a universal phenomenon, there are certain contexts generated by histories of colonial domination, exclusion, racism, sexist social norms, and the presence of organized crime that propel the conditions for an increased rate of femicide. So, gender, class, race, immigration status, age, produce the flesh and bone of the female body whose life is at stake in context of multiple expressions of inequality. In those contexts, femicides are not social anomalies. They play a role, an important role, in a climate of increasing authoritarianism and neoconservatism, and become a form of pedagogy of cruelty. It is a way, actually, of teaching women their place in society, with a punitive and disciplining discourse. Because of that, femicides usually take place under conditions of indifference and impunity. Therefore, a femicide is the distinct mark, I argue, the final one, of the female bodies that have experienced multiple forms of inequality. The dead body becomes a signifier of multiple systems of stratification that end up producing a context of what I call disposability of women. As Melissa Wright argues, the politics of death and the politics of gender go hand in hand and both enter into play to produce a femicide. This is why, in some contexts, like in Central America, we can talk about a gendered necropolitics. That is, a stratifying social system whose discourses and practices end up building a context in which women are biopolitically disposable. And why has Central America become a territory of gendered necropolitics? As I said before, there are certain times, countries, and contexts in which the conditions are more favorable for the flourishing of this gendered necropolitics. And in Central America, transition to democracy after a long period of colonial domination and inequality of different sorts was incomplete and restricted. The democratization process was very rapidly combined with neoliberal policies. According to several studies, in those regions where neoliberal policies have been brutally implemented, there is a tendency to construct extremely violent environments. And we can see it in Central America, and we also can see the result of that at the border of Mexico and the US, and I can relate now with the paper presented by Dr. Mary Romero. Some authors even talk about remasculinization of the state, or on hypermasculinization of the state as a result of the implementation of neoliberal policies. So market ideologies have resulted in unregulated extraction of wealth, which is essential to produce corruption, illegal enterprises, such as drug trafficking and human trafficking, and authoritarianism and impunity. And that creates a context in which women become disposable. So in Central America, we can see an example of how neoliberalism uses democracy as an instrument for doing businesses, but at the same time, it builds a social regime characterized by life experiences under extremely unequal relations of power. This shows that in Central America, and potentially everywhere, democracy can set limits to neoliberal capitalism that capitalism can absorb, but neoliberal capitalism set limits to democracy that democracy cannot absorb. Many of those limits in Central America are set by de facto powers that concentrate power like never before, such as transnational companies and other organized groups that operate in what Rita Segato called the second state. This kind of regime is also called social fascism by Boaventura de Sousa Santos. Social fascism, he says, is a civilizational regime, not a political one. It is characterized by segregation and exclusion, high levels of violence and insecurity, the resurgence of religious fundamentalisms, and renewed relations of power with the global centers. Social fascism produces a society that is politically democratic, but profoundly authoritarian in its social relations, creating what I call a bioarithmetic for the disposability of bodies that are no longer needed, not even as a reserve army. More than ever before, neoliberalisms create a system of social segregation divided into savage zones and civilized zones. In the civilized zones, the social contract does operate, and people can claim all sorts of rights. In the civilized zones, the state is in fact a territory in dispute that can accommodate certain demands from women, LGBTIQ people, workers, etc. However, the civilized zones are becoming smaller and with less people. The rest of the region's people are relegated to the savage zones, enduring high levels of violence, the lethal dynamics of illicit businesses, experiencing exploitation, malnutrition, unemployment, etc. In this space-time of precarious conditions and perpetual violence, because those are the conditions in many regions in Central America of perpetual violence, is where the necropolitics is most easily installed. As a result of an extreme devaluation of life and of all the precarity that people live. So, the establishment of this gender necropolitics produces an instrumentalization of women's bodies, creating a regime of terror and decrease a death sentence for some, especially the most vulnerable due to class, race, and age. The interconnection of market ideologies with traditional gender norms produces also a strong tendency for women to be defined as possessions, trophies, objects of pleasure, and commodities, which opens up many possibilities for exploitation and violence. In other words, neoliberalism and market ideologies, in their savage versions, reinforce the construction of a model of masculinity, which expresses itself as power, domination, and control over women, and consequently as attitudes that lack empathy and promote dehumanization of women. In this context, as Rita Segato says, violence against women stops being collateral damage and is transformed into a strategic objective. So I argue that when these extreme forms of violence become a strategic objective and a part of a hegemonic, punitive, and disciplined discourse, A claim for rights, particularly from the people that live in the civilized zones and are already privileged, could actually hide the factors that cause some of these forms of violence and exclusion. This is because these conditions are not the result of the lack of norms or a weak legislation or a failed state, as some people have argued. These conditions are the result of a regime. So, asking for better legislation or law enforcement measures to deal with violence against women ignores the fact that there is a state complicity. I argue that there is a state complicity, which is an essential component in the operation of this context that make women disposable. Also, the assumption that incarceration of perpetrators is a way of doing justice for the victims only contributes to reinforcing the repressive power of the state. And I am not saying that this type of extreme violence should not be criminalized. What I am saying is that we should not confuse justice with criminalization and incarceration, because in doing so, we only align ourselves with the prison mentality of the neoliberal state. So I argue then that the discourse of unequal relations of power may be easily subsumed within the rights discourse or the instrumental and punitive use of justice. So I'm going to give my final remarks. If we would like to envision a world without the misogynist killing of women, the rights paradigm and the pursuit of justice will fail unless they guarantee women's access to full lives, not only in terms of recognition or representation, but in terms of the social, economic, and political conditions required for the female bodies to exist beyond just survival. We need to think not only about the woman who is killed, but also about the families and communities where those crimes take place, and the harm that these murders cause for this generation and for future generations. So even in this context, even restorative justice is not enough. So basically, I am going to argue that we need to concentrate in an aspiration that probably for now, it belongs to the realm of utopia. But if we lose utopia and we miss it, I don't know how we can struggle for a better life. So we need to start by thinking about how to depatriarchalization, decolonization, demercantilization of life. That will imply a new biopolitics that respects and embraces life in all its forms, including non-human animals, instead of the necropolitics reinforced by neoliberalism. And that can only occur with strong social movements, building alliances with each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Montserrat. Our final panelist for today is Dr. Roland Atzmüller from Johannes Kepler University, Austria. And his paper is titled Confronting the Destruction of Social Rights, Considerations on the Crisis of the European Social Model and Options to Tackle It. Dr. Roland Atzmüller is Associate Professor at Johannes Kepler University and the Institute of Sociology, Department of Theoretical Sociology and Social Analysis in Linz, Austria. After studying in Vienna, where he gained a PhD in political science, and Manchester, he worked for the Working Life Research Center in Vienna since 2002. Roland Atzmüller's works are on critical social theories, state theory, and critical theories of capitalism. His empirical research focuses on changes of welfare systems, mainly in Europe, vocational education and training, active labor market policies, social conflicts. He has various publications, of course, but I'm going to give the floor, and please join us in welcoming Dr. Roland Atzmüller.
Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation and the possibility to talk in this important presidential plenary. As it was introduced, I will present some considerations, some analysis on the crisis of what is called the European social model and options to tackle it, as this destruction of the European social model is basically very much geared towards the overcoming of social rights. My presentation will proceed as follows. I will first give you some insights into what is the crisis or was the crisis of Europe over the last decade, since the onset of the crisis of 2008, and its effect on what is called the European social model, which is closely linked to the transformations of the welfare systems, in particular in Western Europe, but all over Europe you can say, where we have observed, or where we can observe a kind of polarization in the welfare system, which were much more universal in former years, between more workforce and activation-oriented strategies on the one hand and emerging social investment strategies on the other hand, which is said to be an alternative, but I will show you a range of problems about this concept. And then I will basically focus on youth as an example, what is happening in relation to this crisis and these changes, to show you some insights of how it is working out for certain groups, and finally we'll offer some debate, some alternatives. The financial crisis since 2008, which then was transformed in the sovereign debt crisis, hit European countries very hard, and in particular in Eastern Europe, with the notable exception maybe of Poland, and Southern Europe, which is well known, Greece, Spain, for example. And it was not only caused by the financial crisis, which basically started in the US economic sphere, but also by the economic imbalances between European countries, which on the one hand, where you had countries with a high trade surplus and an export-oriented strategy based on wage moderation, so on a relative reduction of wages, and on the other hand, countries with a high trade deficit and a debt-driven growth, which basically led to massive problems, which then came out during the financial crisis. And this led to an explosion of public debt, linked to stimulus packages, bailout programs, and also to the automatic stabilizers of welfare systems, which secured some standard of living during the crisis in the beginning. But it was followed soon by severe and prolonged austerity programs under the control of the European Union in particular, the European Union institutions, and also the IMF, called the Troika. There was the development of a very expanded and differentiated system how to organize the whole crisis management, dominated by the economically strong countries, which basically meant that the crisis countries such as Greece lost a lot of influence over their economic and fiscal and social policies. This was met with massive resistance in many countries, Greece, Spain, Portugal, for example, but this resistance could not really change the strategy of the European Union and the strong countries. So there was an increase in poverty and unemployment, which was following an attack on collective bargaining, a wave of privatization, etc. And so we can see, in my opinion, a double polarization within the European Union or the European countries. On the one hand, between European countries, where you have an increase of social differences, and within European countries, because also the stronger, economically stronger countries, which fared better in the crisis, nevertheless experienced growth of unemployment, poverty, and then social fragmentation. And of course, this crisis contributed, it was not the only factor, is not the only factor, to the growth of far-right and populist right parties, which you can see all over Europe at the moment. The social model, what is meant by it, on the one hand, it's a political concept developed or brought forward first, I think, by Jacques Delors in the 80s. Here's a quote on the PowerPoint slide which defines it. You can find it in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. So it is about high levels of employment, fighting social exclusion, all these kind of things. During the crisis, Mario Draghi, the head of the European Central Bank and former Goldman Sachs banker, said, well, the European social model is dead, we have to get rid of it. It cannot be financed anymore given the crisis, so there's an attack by the political elites. On the other hand, it is can be seen as an analytical concept, even though there are many differences between European welfare states. Some people, or many people, say there's enough commonalities in regard to decommodification, or was enough commonalities in regard to decommodification, collective bargaining, and this kind of things, to say there's a kind of European social model. But this should not lead to the assumption that there were no massive changes, and we'll tell you a few things later on. What you can see, and I will show you some statistics later on in relation to unemployment, is that even now in many countries, unemployment levels have not yet fallen back to pre-crisis levels, in particular in the south and east, and that there are vast differences in this sense between European countries, and that among the groups that were hit hardest were young people after the crisis. And it seems now that the documents by the European Union now highlight that there has been some recovery and stabilization over the last 2 years, which you will find in the statistics I show you, in Southern Europe, some part of Eastern Europe, but nevertheless in many countries, as I said, pre-crisis levels have not been reached, and the pre-crisis level were not very well in many countries anyway. The same can be said about levels of poverty and social exclusion, which of course exploded or grew massively during the crisis since 2008. These are some insights. We will not have the time to go through each country, but that shows 4 years. So the first year, 2008, which was the onset of the crisis, the peak years, 2012 and 13, where you can see in this the massive growth of unemployment in many countries until this year, and now some reductions over the year. But you can see that even after 10 years, pre-crisis levels in many countries have not been reached. And as I said, the levels are quite high. Youth was hit harder, as I said, in many countries. Youth unemployment reaching levels of up to more than 50% in a range of countries. In some countries, you can see the effects were not that bad, like Germany, for example, or also Austria or the Czech Republic. In relation to poverty and social exclusion, similar pictures emerging. On the one hand, also vast differences between countries, and in particular Eastern European countries displaying a high level of poverty and social exclusion. And in particular in relation to youth groups, you can see a massive growth during the crisis since 2008, and in many countries not enough reduction since then. Of course, one of the reasons for it, why, in my opinion, the countries were hit that hard was not because basically the crisis hit the kind of social model which would be not without changes since the 1970s. On the contrary, I think one reason is that since the 1970s, 80s, when the first onslaught by neoliberal governments began on the European welfare state, was that there is now, we can talk, and I'm a bit rough here maybe, that there's a growing polarization and fragmentation of European welfare state. And you can see two poles, but this is a continuum, of course. On the one hand, you have the emergence of activation and workfare-oriented strategies. On the other hand, since the 1990s, linked to the new social democrats, such as New Labour, the emergence or the attempt to create social investment strategies. And one thing which is, to my opinion, very important, and I will highlight that, is that this means a change, in my opinion, in the function of welfare systems. Klaus Offe, going back to an argument by Karl Polanyi, basically said that welfare systems are created by societies, are a societal reaction against the dysfunctional, destructive effects of capitalist accumulation. So they tackle crisis and change that confront society as it is brought forward by capitalist accumulation. But via the neoliberal reform project, basically this task to tackle the crisis, to tackle change, to tackle transformation is shifted towards the individuals and their ability to change and adapt, to cope with cuts, to change and adapt their work abilities, their human capital. That's why there's a focus on work ethic, etc. This also means that they have to take into account the way how they connect to other parts of society. So the social embedding basically also becomes a task of the individuals. Activation and workfare don't have to introduce too much, I think. It's a well-known concept. It basically means that on the one hand, a tightening of access to social rights and a reduction of entitlements and labor market policies, for example, and a focus, for example, on activities to push people into the labor market through work-first activities and through tightening sanctions regimes. So there's a recommodification of labor power, if you like. And it is linked to a privatization of social services, the creation of quasi-markets in this field of social work, labor market policies, and whatever, and the flexibilization, deregulation of labor markets that follows. In recent years, and in particular following the debates as brought forward by these new social democrats, Anthony Giddens was quite important for that. There was a strong focus on social investment strategy, and I would call that focus as an attempt or a tendency towards the emergence of human capital-oriented social policies. They are very often presented as an alternative, but I think they're only the other coin. So you have part of activation and work for some parts of the labor market, and you have social investment strategies for higher educated people or people who are thought to work in the high-tech industries, for example. And of course, you have a continuum, so some activities to transfer people onto such path. It focuses on activities to really legitimize welfare and to reconcile it with the economy and productivity. So all those activities which support growth and competitiveness are fostered. This includes, of course, human capital formation, but also childcare, as this will mobilize certain groups on the labor market, women, of course. Main criticism raised against social investment is that it fosters productive expenditures at the expense of so-called unproductive or non-productive expenditures, such as pensions, for example, or public employees. It privileges the middle classes who can use the strategies by far better, and that, for example, child-centered investment strategies do not really aim at changing the gender division of labor, but are rather geared towards a kind of distrust on the underclass family, as it is very often labeled as a kind of policy to prevent future crime and poverty policy. And of course, there's a debate going on whether this policy should be linked to a strong social security fundament, or whether it's only a basic social security which should be linked to that. In some project I was working on, a European project like a Workable in Society with a range of colleagues from Europe, we were focusing on the outcomes of this strategy on young people. And there was an interesting convergence, I only take one example, about the diagnosis why young people have these problems on the labor market. And it was basically a supply-side oriented interpretation. There was not a focus on the problems of the labor market, on the changing of the welfare state institutions that had been brought about over the recent years. And basically it was the lack of certain qualities these young people display, like problems with the family, low education, drug addiction, non-conformist lifestyle, etc. And so a kind of upskilling basically was seen as the main strategy to tackle that. But the question is, of course, how is this organized, and what would it mean, and how can you do that in a proper way? And there again, this problem of human capital-oriented and employability-oriented social policies emerge again. Because when we take young people, they're confronted with the idea that the human capital orientation assumes a rational economic man who is utility maximizing, looking for success on the market and competing with others. And this is seen or presented to young people as a specific ability of being adult. This becomes a kind of normative interpolation to the subject. They have to constantly adapt, constantly be willing to learn, and this becomes a kind of moral duties. And of course, this is not linked to the development of technical abilities, but also on social skills, on your way how you connect to your social environment, that you think about your friends and who are your proper friends, how you dress, and etc. So this basically has the effect, as you could see in many countries and many activities, that on the one hand they become the target of guidance and support in a very peculiar paternalistic way. Evidently, their strategies maybe to protest or maybe to try to withdraw from the demands of the educational system, of the labor market system, becomes pathologized, seen as youth craziness linked to poverty and this kind of things. And there's a tendency in some countries seen that is emerging that these programs become mandatory and punitive in many aspects. So young people have to do it, otherwise the parents might be punished, they might have to pay fines and whatever. And of course, and this is then the subsequent, or that is quite natural that it follows, there's a strong focus on what we can translate as secondary virtues, on things like they have to develop certain traits of their personality, like industriousness, punctuality, the ability to subordinate. These were all things that were highlighted in interviews. So rationality is reduced to the ability to cope with labor market and accept the social situation as an outcome of human competition. The human capital formation we can see, and the employability orientation, economic orientation, comes to dominate the other problems of socialization of young people. It's basically all geared towards this activity, which is linked to a merger of social work and activation activities, which creates some tensions within the welfare systems as well. I come to my final slides and some thoughts about alternatives. On the one hand, it's clear, and this has been one of the deficits we've seen in these youth policy debates, you cannot change youth policies without taking into account the macro level. So without the replacement of austerity strategies through a program, expanded program of social and ecological investment and the strengthening of social rights, there will not be an adequate and sustainable change. This means to invest in social infrastructures, strengthen social security regimes, and of course strengthen democratic participation in collective bargaining in a transnational sense, if you take the European Union as the unit of analysis. In relation to youth integration, of course, means again an enlargement of the integration activities, not only this focusing on skills that can be used in the economy, but to see learning and education as a form of transformation of individuals, to develop the competences and skills they not only need to work, but also to change social relations and to change society. And this, of course, means, if you take it down to concrete activities, for example, to reverse outcomes of the existing education system, to give a right to education to people, to have exit and voice options instead of mandatory programs. Thank you.
Well, please keep sitting for a minute as we have something special to announce. But before I do that, I want to take a moment to thank all the panelists. Let's give them all a round of applause. I'm going to just make a few announcements. Thank you so much. This evening, we have a spotlight session, The Power of the Media, Reflections, Roles and Responsibilities, on Friday at John Bassett Theatre. We have featured speakers who have been going to talk about the media. We have Liz Doucette from BBC, Chief International Correspondent, United Kingdom, and we have Siddharth Vardarajan, Founding Editor, The Wire, India. And so we hope you will join us this evening for that event. And now, it is my, first of all, thank you to everybody for these past few days. And now it is my distinct pleasure to invite a very special person to this podium. We know him for having a long history of doing wonderful, incredible work, leadership work, being an integral part of the International Sociological Association. Please join me as I welcome the next president of the International Sociological Association for 2018 to 2022, Dr. Sari Hanafi from American University of Beirut, Lebanon. Thank you, Sari. I want to just, before he gives his few moments, we, as a part of becoming now the leader of ISA, we would like you to continue a historic moment and continue many more histories of the ISA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maggie, Margaret Abraham. I am so touched. I'm proud to serve ISA. I think I have really an agenda of, in the same time, continuity, but some changes, make ISA more global, and being very attentive to distribution of ICE activities to all regions, but also to redress some of biases, north-south, gender, class, disability, etc., etc. So I hope I will be up to the bar of your expectation. Thank you so much.
All right, so that finishes this session. Thank you so much for the last 4 years, and we're looking forward to many more exciting conferences. Thank you.